Okay, so not only do you have to have your identities memorized, but remember, as we go through and prove these, you're learning strategies as well, which I wouldn't necessarily say memorize strategies, but know your strategies, know what's available to you. So we're trying to show that this thing is true, and it is true. Okay, so that's kind of nice to know that it does work. Which side would you start on? Left, okay, because it has a quotient, so that's not bad. So notice if you start on the left, and that's fine, your right side becomes your target. So what do you notice in the denominator over here, 1 plus cosine? It is 1 plus cosine. Very good. The variable is theta. Is that equal to anything? No. Not by itself, but if that were a 1 minus cosine squared, if it were a 1 minus cosine squared, we could then call that sine squared, right? This is kind of thinking ahead before you do it. And then if we could call that a sine squared in the bottom, that would be the same as a cosecant squared in the top. So that maybe is a strategy. So what could I do? What could I multiply by to make that into a 1 minus cosine squared? What was our strategy from the very previous problem? Conjugate over the conjugate. Absolutely. So whenever you see a number like a 1 in conjunction with the trig function, added or subtracted, a conjugate over a conjugate is a good thing to try. So 1 minus cosine, 1 minus cosine. So again, looking in the bottom, that gives you a 1 minus cosine squared. And then going to the next line, if you want, that's going to be a sine squared. All right, so that's pretty cool because now that gives me my factor of cosecant squared in the numerator. And then in the top, I need to show that it's equal to secant of theta minus 1. Well, let's go ahead, since it's expanded, let's go ahead and just distribute. Secant times 1 is secant. And then what's cosine times secant? I don't know. I'll write it like that for now. Cosine times secant. All right, so that could be my numerator line. Now we go to the next line on the numerator, and at this point, maybe you just realize that cosine times secant is what? It should be 1. So if you work enough, you get into that train of thought. How are cosine and secant related? They're reciprocals of each other. And what's anything times its reciprocal? 1. So if you just want to call that 1 on the next line, I'm okay with that. But if you don't see it yet, notice that we don't have cosines on the other side. So you might show this extra step and call cosine 1 over secant, bless you, times secant. That would be legal, right? You're replacing this cosine in that spot with its reciprocal 1 over secant. And now on the next line, secant times 1 over secant, that does become 1. So that becomes secant of theta minus 1. And then, of course, this is 1 over sine squared, which becomes a cosecant squared. When you have factors, things that are multiplied, you can slide them from high to low and just put their reciprocal. If that was still not obvious to you on that line, you could do this. You could separate it. 1 over sine squared times the quantity secant of theta minus 1. So that could be an intermediate step. And then call it cosecant squared. I put the, are you quizzing today? Because I know I'm a little bit ahead of you. Okay. Okay. I'll email you the quiz, the key that I just did. Okay. Yes, let's do, we just had important announcements, like on the grind and one act play tonight. What's another one?
Quick hall decorating meeting after school.
Quick hall decorating meeting after school. For juniors, yeah, this is your junior sponsor. She's in it to win it this year.
Yeah.
She was in it to win it last year too, but yeah. So this year, yeah.
Good idea, but I kind of don't want to make any official decisions until I have the people saying, well, on board.
There you go. Right after school in your room.
After school.
Okay. All right.
Let's have one work day, and then Tuesday after school next week put that. But I need help. Like last year, I felt like the junior hall was pretty good, but we had about
It was really good.
40, 50 kids helping.
Yep. Yep.
So it made it easy to get it done. So after school, all I need to do is run through some ideas that's been presented to me, and y'all say it looks good or no, I don't like it, and then we'll move forward from there.
Okay.
But I'm quick. Like I don't like.
All right. I'll mention that the next period too.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. Yep. Good. And if what? 4 o'clock, your room. Okay. And then also this morning at 8 a.m. the QR codes went up at the Commons for Fun Night registration and for Powder Buff Volleyball. So if you haven't done that yet, it should also be in the student iTunes U course. All right, so anyway, there you go. Does the left side look like the right side? Yes. So bam. Okay, whatever you want to say. Or Shazam. What? Boom. Okay, good. Yeah, nice. Is that the only way to do that one? No. Did anyone have the inclination to start on the right-hand side instead of the left-hand side? You did? You started on the right-hand side? You didn't get it. Well, let's see what it would look like if you started on the right-hand side. So if we start over here, now the left side is our target. So you could actually have done this on the left-hand side, on the right-hand side, sorry, just write everything backwards. But maybe you didn't see it that way. So Thornhill, what did you do? Did you distribute first? Oh, you don't want to talk about it. Oh, yeah, you could. Very good. You could say that all of this is over 1, and here you have a secant minus 1, which is a trig function in the presence of a 1 term. That's another good possible candidate for conjugate over the conjugate. That would be secant plus 1 over secant, I can't even write, secant of theta plus 1. So that would be possibility, right? So let's see what that would look like. You multiply your conjugates out every time. That gives you secant squared of theta minus 1. And now that's all over secant of theta plus 1. Is secant squared of theta minus 1 equal to anything? If you're not sure, go off to the side and write 1 plus tangent squared of theta equals secant squared of theta. And then manipulate it. If you get secant squared of theta minus 1, it is. It's equal to tangent squared. So you got cosecant squared now times tangent squared all over secant of theta plus 1. And at this point, you might want to look at your target on the other side, and you're like, okay. Look at the denominator. You got 1 plus cosine. Over here, you have 1 plus secant. It's kind of the same thing, except it's in terms of the wrong trig function. So let's do this. I'll kind of leave the numerator. This would be the scenic route for sure. But I could call secant plus 1. I can call that 1 over cosine plus 1. And now I've created a complex fraction. Hooray, hooray. And now I would multiply by cosine over cosine. You can't do state change flip here because you have 2 terms in the bottom. So now in the top, you've got scoot over, guys. You got another factor in the numerator. Okay. Welcome. And in the bottom, when you distribute, you get cosine times 1 over cosine, which is 1, plus cosine times 1 is cosine, if I can keep talking correctly. So what does that mean? That means now we have our denominator, 1 plus cosine. Yes. And that's all. The only thing that's left to show is that cosecant squared times tangent squared times cosine is equal to secant. How do you think we're going to do that? Put everything in terms of sine and cosine. So let's just kind of keep hanging on here. That's 1 over sine squared times sine squared over cosine squared times cosine of theta all over 1 and all over our denominator. That is looking pretty. Okay, so now you notice those divide out. One of those divides out with one of those. And in the numerator, we are left with 1 over cosine. We're left with a single factor of cosine in the denominator. So what is 1 over cosine? Secant. So you're left with secant of theta over 1 plus cosine of theta. And we hung in there, and we got it. So you have to have some persistence, or realize that maybe you're heading in a wrong direction, and then back up and try a different approach. But if you keep at it, eventually, as long as you're doing legitimate things that are viable, right, replacing things with trig identities, and you're not breaking any math rules, you'll eventually get there. Okay? So that would be a way to do it on the right-hand side. Any other comments or questions? Did anyone do it a little bit differently? Because there's more than one way to skin a cat. Like, how do people know that? Like, oh, you did it differently than I did, right? Like, at what time were people skinning cats on such a wide level that it became an idiom, right? When you had fur traders back in the early Appalachians, they weren't like hunting cats, were they? Oh, that's a nice cat jacket you got there, right? Maybe beaver pelts, right? But not cats. I don't know. There's also more than one way to skin a beaver. How do we get off subject so easily? Any other comments or questions about this particular proof? All right, we got like 4 minutes left. I don't think we have time for another one. So let's just kind of extract some strategies. Do any quote-unquote obvious math. Why is that in quotations? It may not be obvious to everybody, right? Slapping you in the face. But what does that mean? Distribute, right? We distribute up here. Rather than sit around and did nothing, well, we didn't distribute, did we? You could have distributed, right? Combine like terms, combine like factors, factor. Do something. If you're not creating it by multiplying by a clever form of 1, do some obvious math if there's something to do. Factor, expand, and then, of course, do trigonometric substitutions. But the important thing is if you start on one side, the right side becomes your target. So you are trying to make it look like that. Yeah, cool. With that in mind, if you had started on the right-hand side, you could have done what we said yesterday, create what you need. If you knew that you needed a 1 plus cosine in the denominator and you put it over 1, maybe you multiply by 1 plus cosine over 1 plus cosine instead of the conjugate of secant minus 1. And maybe that gets you to where you need to go a little bit faster. So as long as you're multiplying by clever forms of 1, you can kind of create what you need on one side by making it match up, and then do some obvious math, and whatever's left residually should work out to what you need, okay? So once you memorize your identities and you go through the strategies, how do you become really good at these? Practice, practice, and the third one would be practice. Okay. Speaking of practice, 1X has been practicing their play tonight, right? Our radioactive friends, our shining light stars is tonight. Our shining fellows, lives. Our shining lives tonight, $5. So go to the meeting after school, then go home and grab $5, come back up here and watch our shining lives. All right, and then go by on the grind and say you're from New Braunfels.